afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'd ask that you take your seats and settle down so that we can begin this afternoon session. I'm Dr. Pia De Saleni. I'm the Chancellor of the Diocese of Orange and a roving theologian or an itinerant theologian. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce first Dr. Elizabeth Lev. She's an American art historian who happens to live and work in Rome. She is currently the 2018 Meiser Visiting Fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture. After finishing her studies at the University of Chicago in 1989, Elizabeth moved to northern Italy to do her graduate work at the University of Bologna. In 2001, she began teaching art history at Duquesne University's Italian campus, where she continues to serve on the faculty. After teaching Renaissance art at the John Cabot University for 5 years, she has since joined the teaching staff at the Pontifical University of the Angelicum in Rome, as well as at Christendom College. Lev is the author of a number of books, including the recently released How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, The Triumph of Beauty and Truth in Counter-Reformation Art, which has been published by Sophia Institute Press. Her paper this afternoon is titled The Art of Good Government, Ambrogio Lorenzetti in the Palazzo Publico of Siena. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Pia, and thank you, Jennifer. This is kind of fun, the European encounter here in Indiana. And thank you especially, Carter, for inviting me here and letting me talk about what I love best. Although I have to admit, I do have this vague feeling after these really important discussions we've been listening to all morning that art history comes across as something that looks a little bit more like comic relief, I'm afraid. And so that's where I'm going to begin with my own little bit of comic relief, if you will. Art is something that in many ways, it seems to be something that's for amusement, no? It's pleasurable to look at. It's easy to enjoy in many ways. It's good filler between one gelato and another, as it were. But because of its incredibly powerful way of communicating, it also has a very, very special gift. And that special gift is it can tell stories in a very, very effective way. Now, I'm afraid I have just had a fascinating incident of dropping all my painter papers in a hole in the table, but I have since retrieved them, so we should be able to commence as planned. So I want to tell you a story. We're talking about higher powers, and I want to tell you a story about something that exceptional that happened in the 12th century in Italy, in northern Italy. And the beautiful thing about telling the story is I get to tell you this story with pictures, which is what art does. So, after 500 years of periods of bandying around between one kind of feudal lord and another, something very important happened in northern Italy. You're looking at a map of Italy right around 1000, and you'll notice that they're big, vast stretches of land. These are territories owned by barons and kings and princes. Italy, like most of Europe, was governed under a feudal system. However, in the 1100s, something wonderful happened, and the map began to change dramatically. And so for better or worse, the map of Italy going into 1200, 1300 becomes a lot more colorful, which is, of course, pleasing for art historians. And you'll notice that it begins to have a lot more variety, but variety of a type of little city-states. And so these first little areas, particularly in Tuscany, for complicated reasons that are kind of fascinating but too long to get into, Tuscany emancipates, these little towns in Tuscany emancipate themselves from these feudal lords, and they set up little self-governing states called comune. Now, they're trying to figure out how to run these comune. They look to the Roman Empire and they come up with the idea of the council. Now that sounds great, this Roman idea of the council. Well, they take on the council, but they don't really know what to do with it. So we have overreaching dictators, we have figures who don't know how to deal with the needs of a new city-state. And in the words of historian Ferdinand Schwill, that the first free government to be created on feudal soil was a rude and imperfect mechanism is not very astonishing. But within a few decades, the towns began to change. And so by 1138, we had the Republic of Florence, Lucca in 1160, and shortly thereafter, in 1234, they were joined by Siena, a tiny landlocked territory which was flanked by Florence to the north and the Papal States to the south. The minuscule republic, it had a population of somewhere between 10 and 15,000 in 1234. That was the number of people who worked in the wool industry in nearby Florence. It first approached the problem of government using the same solution as its neighboring states. They chose a chief magistrate, who they now called the podesta, from the potestas, a figure with power, from another state. That way you could theoretically avoid internal corruption. And then they had 24 elected priors who were drawn at least half from the citizens. To further promote the citizen government, all government legislation had to be approved by a council of 300, all of whom were Sienese. Now, this National Republic of Siena resisted both internal and external attempts of subjugation. The Battle of Monteperti, which is one of the most famous legends, and it's actually not a historical fact in the history of Siena, 1260, they defeated Florence in a surprising victory which they attributed to the Virgin Mary, and indeed consecrated the city to the Virgin Mary from that moment on. Then a few years later, the city was racked with internal battle, as you had the nobles, or the grandi, as they were called, the aristocratic or noble set of the city, who had managed to wrest away the power from the popolani, or the people. And eventually, when they managed to subdue this internal revolt, they redesigned the government again. And so now the Republic would be led by a group of executive magistrates. They would be called the Nine, or the Nove, and the Nove would be responsible. They'd be chosen every 2 months, and they would be chosen exclusively from the merchant class, preventing the nobility from getting a hold of the government. They drafted a new constitution in 1309, in volgare, which any of you who have taken Italian, you recognize that is the word that they use for Italian, the native dialect, no longer a constitution in Latin, but a constitution, an instrument which could be read by all of its citizens. Now, the Republic took advantage of this moment of peace to start work on, first and foremost, the new cathedral. And again, focusing their attention immediately upon building at the highest point of the city, the church dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin. And in that church, Duccio created the new iconographical masterpiece, which is known as the Maestà, the Virgin in Majesty. We'll be returning to these things a little bit later. This was done in 1311. And in 1297, the Sienese built the Palazzo Publico. And the Palazzo Publico would become, actually the Palazzo Publico is a little further down on the slide, the Palazzo Publico would be the home of the governing body of Siena. And then the circled section on the map is the great triumph of Siena. It is the moment that the city is no longer landlocked. They reach out to a port city, and they develop the port of Talamone. So now Siena's population has burdened to 100,000 people, which is an incredible growth over the space of about 100 years. And so they were basking in success. They are sitting on the Via Francigena, which is one of the main pilgrimage routes from Rome to the north. The Sienese shops thrived with a steady stream of visitors, as they still do today. It had successfully expanded its territories. The new cathedral was being planned to replace one, to make it even bigger than the one in St. Peter's, the church in St. Peter's. The Sienese merchants sold their goods throughout Europe, and the bankers of Siena were negotiating loans with sovereigns. So to commemorate the success of self-government, here's the Palazzo Publico, to commemorate the success of self-government, the Council of Nine commissioned a pioneering work of art for their deliberative chambers. Painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti between 1337 and 1339, the ambitious program of the effects of good government in the city and in the country, as it's called, stands alone as the first piece of comprehensive Republican art in history. Now, republics had produced art. It's very easy to remember that the Parthenon was built in Athens in the moment of this great republic. The Roman Republic built beautiful temples, not to mention its great engineering achievements, but they don't produce an art to represent what is the Republic. Perhaps the closest thing we have in the history of art might be the Parthenon friezes, where you see the entire citizenry of Athens all gathered together, one after the other, in this common act of worship of the goddess Athena. But they had never tried to illustrate what it meant to be self-governing. Most of the great art that you and I would know comes from autocratic rule. Where do pyramids come from? Or the magnificent, the Colossus of Rhodes, made for the Kingdom of Rhodes, the Augustus Prima Porta, and the famous Pantheon. These works are not made by or for republics. These works are made to celebrate these autocratic rulers. And so, Ambrogio was heading into uncharted artistic territory. And the result would be one of the most beautiful, and I'd be willing to propose the most beautiful, testimonies to the precious gift of self-rule in history. So Lorenzetti was well chosen to the task. He was a citizen of Siena. He was about 50 years old at the time of the commission. Ambrogio, together with his brother Piero, had been working as painters since 1317. They had been trained in the elegant artistic milieu of Siena under Duccio and Simone Martini with their beautiful fabrics. Their love of finery and color was cultivated. But several years in Florence had made Ambrogio aware of the special techniques pioneered by Giotto, who was an international celebrity by 1320, and the interest in pictorially rendering larger spaces, deeper spaces in art. He also was very good, Giotto, at this rendering of the idiosyncrasies of human expressions, paintings that were relatable, paintings that gave us space. He also was brought into the realm of another very famous Tuscan artist, Florentine artist, who was Dante Alighieri, who died in 1321, shortly after completing that amazing work of art, again in the vernacular of the Divine Comedy. So Ambrogio was chosen for this task not only because he had a formidable artistic resume, but also because of what Giorgio Vasari described as, and I quote, attention in his youth to letters, a useful and pleasant accompaniment to him in his painting, and so great an ornament to his whole life that he was intimate with men of learning, and was also employed in the service of the government of his republic. So the room, here we have, by the way, Giotto and Dante. The room where Ambrogio was to paint was nestled in the large council chamber where the 300 convened, between the large chamber where the 300 convened and the quarters where the 9 magistrates were required to live during their tenure. They were forced to live inside that building to avoid the problem of corruption by locals. It was a relatively intimate space. It was 25 feet by 45 feet, and it was illuminated by one window. Hold on a second if I can find this. One window which comes in from the other side of the slide. So it comes in from a window that faces over the Piazza del Campo. Ambrogio covered 3 of the 4 walls with frescoes, effectively framing the highest executive council of the Republic with allegorical representations of the virtues and vices associated with politics and their effects on both the city and the countryside. It was not only an admonition to the 9 of their serious responsibilities, but it was also a reminder to the citizens who came to present legislation to the 9 of the forces constantly at work that could decide the fortunes or the failure of the Republic. To create what would become his masterpiece, Lorenzetti drew upon over 20 years of artistic experience, especially in rendering 3-dimensional spaces and naturalistic details, a very new thing in the artistic horizon. But he also brought to bear his love of letters on the work. Treatises on philosophy of government were beginning to circulate in the 13th century. Most famously, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle is beginning to circulate in this period. But there were also several practical guidebooks. This is a little bit where I want to be looking at today. There's one aspect of the political philosophy and the great sweeping thoughts, but then there is Ambrogio Lorenzetti, who has recourse to a series of practical handbooks and advice books for magistrates that were circulating in Tuscany as they're beginning to think out this problem of self-rule. Some were even written in Volgare, and perhaps the most famous of them is the one on the far right, which is Brunetto Latini's, originally published in French as the Petit Trésor, but then it becomes Il Tesoretto, the little treasure. Laden with practical advice, it had realistic evaluations of its age, it had colorful descriptions. Latini's book lovingly presented the precious jewel, which was self-government. So he brings together, Lorenzetti, this sort of practical knowledge that's circulating in his own language together with the beauty of this art that he's been practicing for years. Interestingly, while Aristotle's works were still slowly circulating, treatise writers actually had access to one other very important document, and it was the De Officiis by Cicero. There were 150 copies circulating that we know of that were circulating in the 13th century. So you have the Republic in Rome, an author write his last work written as the crumbling vestiges of the empire are falling around him. Right before his murder, you have someone who is looking around and explaining what is a republic, what isn't a republic, giving us very practical advice from a lifetime of service of the Roman Republic. So my first point, again, in how Lorenzetti is going to approach this is that his inspiration is going to be more Roman than Greek, practical and very, very based in the real situation. So Ambrogio's work reflected a new love of art, the art that is volgare. He reflected this new love of a colloquial dialectic art, an art of the people. So as Dante's Divine Comedy brought poetry, philosophy, theology into an art that reflected real emotions, relatable situations, actual human history, all in a comprehensible language, Giotto, at the same time, had captured shame, curiosity, affection, puzzlement in the sacred stories he had painted in the Scrovegni Chapel. And so Lorenzetti knew he wasn't painting for a pulpit, he wasn't painting for a lecture hall, he was painting for a boardroom. And so he's illustrating theoretical concepts to businessmen, and he would take political theory and the practical concerns of running a republic and translate them into his great vernacular painting, which is good and bad government. So the entrance was from this, the perspective of a visitor into the room is very different from how you experience the room of the Palazzo Publico today. The door you see on the right-hand side didn't exist at the time. The real door was a few steps across, just a few steps down, you can see it outlined in the red, and so the visitor came in, walked to the small wall opposite the window, which is where the 9 were seated. The paintings by Lorenzetti occupy the 3 walls that would have surrounded the visitor, but most importantly, the visitor walks in, and what's the first thing he or she would have seen? He, I'm afraid, in this particular case, would have seen? He would have seen the images of the effects of bad government. So right off the bat, it's along the wall that never receives light. Physically, in the room, the way the painting is placed, it never receives the light from the window. It's perennially cast in shadow. You see a painting of desolation, images of a countryside that has been ravaged. The painting was very seriously damaged in 1350, so big, huge patches are actually missing. But what you see is a desolate landscape, uncultivated crops, a town succumbing to flames, and soldiers roaming the countryside. Scattered stones of what were once buildings lie abandoned. The countryside is governed by fear. The countryside is governed by fear. No one sows or reaps, no one plays or herds, only warriors flourish in this world. And the inscription of Timur, who represents fear, reads, "Because each seeks only his own good in this city, justice is subject to tyranny. Wherefore, along this road, nobody passes without fearing for his life, since there are robberies inside and outside the gates. And as you even look, as the visitor turns towards the nine in the room, the next thing you see are the gates of the city. And the gates lead into this desolate, desolate place, very reminiscent of those opening lines of the third canto of the Inferno. Through me you go to the grief-racked city, through me you go to everlasting pain. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So it really builds on this, a visualization of this dark city. Inside the city walls, the situation worsens. Rape, robbery, the dangers of close confines in a world without law or justice. So you see here is a woman who's about to be raped, a woman who's been left dead on the ground. Here you see no building, no repair, people who cower at the very tops, hiding in the attics. There are no children in this city. The only person who remains busy is the weapons maker. Lorenzetti closes this sobering scene with a group that looks like a parody of a royal court. There's several creatures who are barely human, and they gather around the demonic central figure of tyranny. He's shrouded in black, he has horns and tusks, and he's actually drawn from medieval illustrations of the devil, embodying the demonic nature of those who betray the trust of the people. He's motivated by the three gravest of vices. Let's see if I can back that up. The three gravest of vices. Greed on the left with her strong box and her hook. You have vainglory with her mirror and her thin little reed, but the most deadly of all of them is pride, superbia. With her red dress and her fierce forward-looking gaze, she holds on to the yoke that enslaves all who serve her. The tyrant keeps a goat under his foot, which is a very interesting little choice. It's not just a symbol of generic wickedness, it's also a symbol of lust. It's an image of, the Greeks use it to make satyrs, but in the 14th century, as northern Italy gets its first taste of luxuries and the high life, you start seeing imagery and sermons that deal a lot with sexual sin. And so even Dante himself recognizes his weakness when in the Inferno, he faints at the sight of Paolo and Francesca who have succumbed to lust and are punished forever, or he puts even our Brunetto Latini, the great political theorist, ends up in the circle of the sodomites, where Dante writes, quote, "Clerks and great and famous scholars defiled in the world by one and the same sin," end quote. The tyrant uses desires to keep his people underfoot. Now to the right, tyranny is flanked by cruelty, who throttles an infant while brandishing a serpent. It's interesting to see that 600 years ago, government-sponsored industry for the murder of infants was considered a bad thing. And treason holds a strange chimeric creature, the face of a sheep but the body of a scorpion. Fraud rounds out the group, fair of face and bejeweled, but her bat wings and bare paws reveal the savage hidden nature of this type of deception. Now to the left of tyranny, sinistra in Italian, he put the deadliest trio, the greatest dangers to the Republic, external and internal. War stands at the outer edge with his sword raised, ready to drain resources. Closer to home, the more insidious threats involve Führer, the centaur figure, which you see here, that mixture of horse, bear, man, and wolf, horse, boar, well, wolf, and man, illustrates the danger and the damage caused by mob rule. The stone in his hand alludes to the custom of throwing stones at buildings by angry mobs. That's how Michelangelo's David's arm was damaged in 1527. And of course, the sword alludes to the physical violence towards citizens. But the most striking of his vices, nothing quite like it before. In the case of Lorenzetti, he painted the figure of division, or faction fighting in a way no one had ever seen before. First of all, the figure is dressed as Siena. She's wearing the balzana. On the right, you see the coat of arms of the city of Siena, and she holds a saw, dividing herself in half. And so this image, which every single writer, from Cicero to Sallust to Latini, every last one of them, understood the incredible danger, the greatest danger to the Republic, came from internal faction fighting. And then on the lowest level, you have the images of, you had the image of the citizenry who have taken the figure of justice, this immense, beautiful figure of justice. She's bound, her scales are broken, and she's held to by the littlest of people. Incredibly vivid, very, very powerful imagery. But fortunately, this dire view of human weakness is not the focus of the work. It occupies a far smaller amount of space in the room, as Dante's Commedia begins with the Inferno to prepare us for the Paradiso. So as the viewer turned to the nine, he found them seated, bathed in the morning Siena sun under the personification of good government. August personages rectify the unease left by the motley band of the earlier fresco. A thriving community moves in an orderly fashion under the shield of virtues of good government. An allegorical array spills out into everyday life and the joining wall, unfurling 45 feet of fresco detailing the effects of good government in the city and the country. And what a joyous spectacle it is. A forest of pastel buildings rise in the background. Construction and growth flourish. Here's the new cathedral underway. Shoemaking. Some of the great Tuscan art is being taken care of. You have learning taking place, and you even have love. Courtship and children, flowers society renews itself on the most fundamental level. The enigmatic image of people dancing in the streets was actually frowned upon in these hardworking republics, but here it's seen as joy, not unlike when we see Fra Angelico's angels dancing in his images of paradise about 100 years later. Outside the walls, no longer necessary for protection, but simply a distinction between urban life and country life, the countryside sprawls in an almost cinematic rendering of the Tuscan Hills. You can actually see here the Tuscan, they've reached their little port city of Talamone in the distance, and you see even the undertaking of activities in the fields. So you see in the background the grapes where they're making, remember we're very close to Montalcino. So Montalcino, where they produce of course the Brunello, you have a gathering of wheat, you have many, many beautiful things that are happening. You even have rest and relaxation as people enjoy the city, enjoy the countryside, thanks to Securitas. And the figure of Securitas holds the sign saying, government sees the months of flowering, the harvests of liberal arts, the circuit of security lets us know that people can travel and roam safely in the countryside because they are secure. And this image actually is drawn from Roman image of victory. So, what creates the circumstances to bring forth such prosperity? Firstly, in the minds of the Sienese, it's the Republic. And so where other treatises might favor kingship, you'll see that above bad government, you see the months of desolation, you see Jupiter, and for some reason the French coat of arms. Down below, a series of unknown tyrants, the only one who is identifiable is Nero. Then, above good government, you see the papal coat of arms, Mercury, spring, and the moon. And then below, you see the liberal arts. The papal coat of arms is not there to represent the monarchy of the papacy, but to start to hint at a higher power. So the good government, it's not overtly represented, but there is something guaranteeing this good government. When the viewer turns back to the nine, you would see him sitting underneath the allegorical court, and it's divided into three rungs. The three rungs have the theological virtues, then the political virtues, and underneath the citizenry. Here we see the personification of Siena. The personification of Siena in a robe called the Balzana. It's the same colors as the Balzana. He's an older man, Senus, to be associated with wisdom. You see the image of the Roman Republic. Siena in 1297 declares itself descendants of Remus. They're founded by the descendants of Remus. The rope that you see them holding unites all the citizens through concord and turns into a solid staff. Look closely at the relief on Martini's, relief on the shield, and you will see the image of Simone Martini's Maestà, which is in the council room. And then the title of the work, CSCV, the Comune of Siena, the City of the Virgin. Next to him, you have the image of what guarantees this good government, justice, seated on the same level as Siena itself. Below her is concord, something worshipped from the time of the beginning of the Roman Republic. And above her, she holds a plane as she hands the rope of concord, all the citizens, 24 pulling the rope. She holds the rope of concord as she looks up towards the image of wisdom. This beautiful idea of love justice, you are judges of the earth, think of the Lord in goodness, seek him in the simplicity of your heart. And again, the figure looks upwards towards wisdom. Wisdom in Siena represented as the maestà. The great wisdom is not the abstract type of wisdom, a wisdom that's infused or a lucky guy who happens to know more. The wisdom we're talking about is the sede sapientia, the Virgin Mary. And then Brunetto's beautiful lines in rhyme, which tell us about this poetry of all people pulling the common cord. He got these ideas from Giotto, who had already done images of virtues which look like they're in stone, but Lorenzetti added a really beautiful, brilliant color, not an abstract concept, but a living, lively concept. And so the series of virtues that surround the figures, surround Siena, will end up being the jewels of the virtues. You have justice, again flanking, you have fortitude, you have prudence, temperance, and two new virtues. You have the image of magnanimity, coined by Cicero, and the most important virtue, which is peace. Peace is represented here as this beautiful reclining figure. She is the guarantor. She looks out towards the countryside, she's the center of the entire picture. She's the center of the entire room. She gazes out towards the countryside. She picks up that wonderful Roman image of Pax, the cult invented by Augustus, and she governs while leaning upon the armor that has been discarded by war. So this painting, which represents this exceptional image of all of these figures brought together, it shows on one hand a drawing from the ancient Roman design. It shows also Lorenzetti's ability to represent space. It's considered in the history of art as one of the great secular paintings. As a matter of fact, this painting has been connoted because it doesn't have overt religious imagery. But the achievements of this artist in the realm of iconography, composition, and especially perspective can't be understated, but have generally been claimed in the secular arm of art. Done to celebrate the work of human hands, government, industry, commerce, Lorenzetti's masterpiece would be the precursor to Renaissance imagery that has so often claimed to be the triumph of secularism in art. However, beyond the Marian references discussed before, there is another artistic topos that serves as the precedent to the vast expanse of events in this scene. The Last Judgment, ubiquitous in churches and chapels throughout Italy and France in this era. In these vast frescoes, which extend vertically as opposed to Siena's horizontal orientation, viewers are confronted with good and evil, punishments and rewards, justice before the heavenly court, and a vast community which, despite differences in station, dress, gender, and position, they all appear equal before the great judge. In Giotto's Scrovegni chapel version, which you're looking at, the artist moves us through varied landscapes into the chaotic tumble of the wickedness and into the orderly arrangement of the saved. They're all of equal height, like the citizens of Concordia. Lorenzetti transposed this most potent image of accountability to higher power into the setting of everyday life, infusing the sacred into everyday, mundane business of Sienese citizen. As the Last Judgment proclaims the necessity for man, given free will to practice self-governance through virtues so as to ensure eternal peace, so Lorenzetti apportioned a share of that great apocalyptic vision to reveal the beauty of self-government and its virtues, and to encourage civic peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. We'll be doing question and answer after both presentations. So our next speaker is Jennifer Donnelly. After nearly 2 decades in Paris for studying and then working with various nonprofit and cultural institutions, Jennifer now lives in a sleepy village on the banks of Lake Lucerne in the German-speaking region of Switzerland. I want to go to there. Where she is currently at work on a collection of essays about the role of art in society, as well as on a historical novel centered on a sculpture in Rome. As a graduate of the Great Books program at St. John's College in Annapolis, she holds advanced degrees from l'École, do you want to say that?
L'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales.
Thank you, merci, and the University of Paris. From 2008 to 2017, she worked with the Terra Foundation for American Arts Global Headquarters in Paris, where she was responsible for international conferences and lecture series, particularly programs emphasizing cultural dialogue and exchange between the United States and Europe. She was also involved in the Terra Summer Residency in Giverny, a residential fellowship program for doctoral candidates and emerging artists, of which she is also a former fellow. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello. Now for something slightly different. I want to, while I'm figuring out where my images are, there we go. I would like to thank, of course, the Center for Ethics and Culture for having me back again. It is such a pleasure and such an honor to be here. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Carter. And thank you, Liz, as well. It's such an honor to present alongside you, and rather daunting as well. I am going to take us out of Italy into Paris, and then out of Paris to America. And the painting that you see here, I will not be talking about, but it's in the collection of the Terra Foundation for American Art, which Pia just mentioned, where I spent many years working. And it's by Samuel Fb Morse, who you may know as a painter, but you probably know as the inventor of Morse code, who traveled a lot in France, as many Americans did at that time, and took the Italian idea of painting the famous paintings and spaces of the museums, and this is a view of copyists in the Grand Gallery of the Louvre, which we will be visiting again in a few moments. When the poet Rainer Maria Rilke was living in Paris in the early years of the 20th century, he loved to go wandering through the city's passageways, gardens, even zoos, and one day on a visit to the Louvre, he encountered a Greek bust, perhaps this one. He was stopped in his tracks. Between this fragment from a civilization that had thrived some 2 millennia before and the young poet from an empire on the brink of disintegration itself, a dialogue began, which was captured in his poem, The Archaic Torso of Apollo, which some of you may know. It's a gorgeous poem, and if you don't know it, I encourage you to read it, because it's really stunning. But what happens in this is that the statue, even though it has no head, no mouth, has a dialogue with the poet, and he can see, the bust can see everything. He understands everything. He understands everything about you, what lies beneath the surface. And the conclusion of the poem, which is very, very dramatic and very urgent, is, "Du musst dein Leben ändern." You must change your life. Comparing the visit of the French writer and diplomat Stendhal about 100 years earlier to Florence, we might recall that upon visiting the monumental tombs to Machiavelli, Galileo, and Michelangelo in the Basilica of Santa Croce, actually we're still in Italy, can never leave Italy, Stendhal experienced, in his words, quote, "a sort of ecstasy from the idea of being in Florence, close to the great men whose tombs I had seen. I had palpitations of the heart. Life was drained from me. I walked with the fear of falling." This is from looking at tombs. It is a reaction that has been noticed in many tourists to Italy since, and baptized by a Florentine psychiatrist as the Stendhal syndrome. In short, there's great potency in monumental objects from the past, whether we encounter them in museums, churches, outdoor parks, municipal buildings, or elsewhere, and their effects on us can be overwhelming. But these objects of power are by no means all objects of art. My 7-year-old son, for example, has a conversation going on with the Apollo 11 lunar mission and the Space Shuttle Discovery at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and its annex near the Dulles Airport, which has been furthered on multiple visits that can only be described as pilgrimages. Nor are all encounters with these objects creative. Indeed, some are destructive. The Pietà of Michelangelo was seriously damaged by a visitor with a knife in 1972. A few years ago in Paris, the bridge at Argenteuil from Monet was punched. And at a museum in Avignon, around the same time, a woman kissed a Cy Twombly painting while she was wearing bright red lipstick. She claimed it was an act of love at her trial. She was sentenced anyway. So for some years now, I have been studying the reactions of visitors to museums and monuments. And so I was intrigued to learn a few months ago that the Louvre, the site of Rilke's encounter, and my own local museum for about 2 decades, had become the set for a new music video. I was last up to date on new music videos circa maybe 1989, but since this one involved a museum, it did turn up in my news feeds. Here we are back in the Grande Galerie du Louvre, which we saw in that first image from Morse. And here we have 2 of the music industry's biggest stars at the moment, Jay-Z on the left and Beyonce on the right, here recording together as the Carters. No relation to Carter Sneed, I don't think. So they're sitting here enthroned, as it were, in the Grand Gallery of the Louvre, the same place where, as a child, Louis XIV would chase foxes on specially organized hunts indoors before he grew up and thought the place was too shabby and decided to build Versailles, as one does. And also where students from Delacroix to Picasso and countless others would sit and copy the masterpieces, as we saw in that first image, a little bit different time period. The song is called Ape, S-H asterisk T. The asterisk is theirs, not mine. And while it's essentially an ode to the star's wealth and fame, the video gives a fascinating glimpse into the ways that a museum can act as a realm of memory, what the historian Pierre Nora calls a lieu de mémoire, a realm of memory, a place which, quote, by dint of human will or the work of time, has become a symbolic element of the memorial heritage of any community. I am going to try to show you just a few moments of this video. It might not work, so you might be spared. Liz just told me a few moments ago that she, what was the quote, despises this video with a special type of despisal or something. But anyway, I'm going to let you all. The video opens contemplatively, as we saw, with an angel perched on the roof of the museum. His pose mimics the gargoyles of the Cathédrale de Notre Dame, which is nearby, and which we perhaps hear the bells of chiming in those opening bars. We leave the angel to keep watch outside of the museum, and our gaze enters inside the museum. We swept over a few ceilings that are elaborately painted, and then zoomed in on a few details of individual canvases before settling here on the Mona Lisa, arguably the most famous work in the museum, perhaps in the world, and to the couple that are standing before it. Now, their eyes are looking straight into ours. They're not looking at the painting. And the room is strangely devoid of the usual selfie stick wielding throngs that one normally sees in front of the Mona Lisa. At this point in the video, the silence breaks, the music begins, and for the next 5 minutes or so, we see 2 types of images primarily. The first, I'm going to not play that for you, so I'll just describe it quickly. The first is the singers before some of the museum's most well-known icons, the Venus de Milo, the Great Sphinx of Tanis, the Glass Pyramid of Ayampe, not unlike tourists in snapshots that are hashtagged on social media. Another set of images, slightly differently, makes reference to political movements. At one point, for example, members of the singer's entourage take the knee. in reference to the recent protests that involved kneeling rather than standing during the singing of the national anthem before football games. And at the same time, the lyrics describe how Jay-Z refused to play at the Super Bowl. The lyrics that accompany all of these images are essentially lyrics about the couple's worldly success. The opening words that we heard are, it's ridiculous to kind of say like Beyonce, like you're reading Rilke, but stack my money fast and go. It's like I feel like I need to dance when I say this, but stack my money fast and go, fast like my Lambo car. It took me a few times. And soon thereafter, we live in lavish, I got expensive fabrics, I got expensive habits, and so on. In fact, the lyrics are full of the cardinal vices of pride, greed, and vainglory that we see on the walls in Siena. So the imagery, on one hand, is clearly playing with placing bodies of color in a museum space that has been critiqued in recent years for excluding them, both as subjects and as artists. This aspect of the video has been pointed out in most of the reactions that I've read, from music critics to critical academics. A reviewer in Rolling Stone, for example, wrote that, quote, much of the potency of the ape shit, and he doesn't use the asterisk video, comes from the contrast drawn between the, quote, white art on the walls and the black women on the gallery floors. The Louvre's stature depends on people believing that the coronation of Empress Josephine, which we see here, is the art. This is still the Rolling Stone reviewer, by the way, not me. But the eye tells a different story. Hanging beyond Beyonce and her dancers, her painting is reduced to wallpaper, end quote. So I disagree somewhat with this analysis. While portrayals of people and works by non-white artists are indeed underrepresented in many museums of historical Western art, and this for reasons that are various and complex, I'm not convinced that this video achieves as much regarding this state of affairs as has the work of certain contemporary artists, curators, scholars, who are working and have been for some years to draw attention to this imbalance. In fact, I would argue that this video, rather than making the museum more inclusive, reaffirms the exclusionary class-based powers at its historical foundations. The Louvre, long before it opened as a public museum, was a royal palace. It was the home of kings. It was the seat of national power. After the monarchy crumbled in the revolution, the public gained access to the palace, or at least part of it. At first it was only the gallery, the grand gallery that we've seen in these images. And there was a shift of power that was reflecting the democratic Enlightenment ideals that were quite young at the time, which also included briefly the emancipation of slavery in the French colonies, which was then reinstated. But that's another story. But within a few years of becoming a public museum, the Louvre became the site of an even stronger political power when Napoleon I crowned himself emperor, which is related to the painting we see here, which of course famously shows him not crowning himself, which is what he did after snatching the crown from the Pope behind him, but crowning Josephine, his wife at the time, who he divorced a couple years later because she had not borne a male heir. Another story also. But I mention all this just to note how much that the Louvre as a museum is a realm of memory that is closely associated with power, political power, aesthetic power, power to judge what is hung on the walls, power to judge who views what is hung on those walls. My argument with this video is that when the Carters empty out the museum and pose as the masters of the museum, they don't subvert this heritage of ownership and power. They don't change anything that needs changing if it does need changing, but they paint themselves into it. After Napoleon and Josephine, we get Jay-Z and Queen Bee. That's my joke. You can laugh. But what fascinates me here is that in 2018, we still have wealthy Americans using the treasure trove model of museum as a source of inspiration, as a source for reshaping and elevating their personal identity and status, just like the robber barons of the Gilded Age. You recall during that period, it became a rite of passage for nouveau riche American industrialists to ship artwork and artifacts from Europe to America by the boatload, and then to construct palace-style houses and galleries to house them in. We have this in in New York, in the homes and libraries of J.P. Morgan, Frick, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the now defunct Corcoran Museum in Washington, D.C. We even had monasteries being reconstructed, like the cloisters, which was purchased by John D. Rockefeller and built, reconstructed partially in New York. So Beyoncé and Jay-Z are continuing this trope about collective memorial space and personal identity, which we see evoked in the work of Edith Wharton and Henry James, The Golden Bowl, with the protagonist who wants to build a museum back home in an American city. And yet, while in this video, the museum as a holder of cultural memory emerges as the more powerful entity for me, there are a couple of carefully crafted scenes that don't brag about money or pay lip service to injustice, but rather respond visually to the works on view. And this is where I would argue its aesthetic power does come in. Liz might disagree with me, but we can talk about that. We have here the gown of Beyoncé is echoing the folds in the gown of the Winged Victory, which had been carved to suggest motion and flight. This was a leap forward in the history of art to be able to depict figures not as static and stationary, but as actually moving through space. We have here the headdresses of the two dancers that are creating the same, it's called a lit de repos in French, this kind of sofa, Greco-Roman sofa, in the portrait of Madame Récamier, who was known as a brilliant and beautiful holder of salons in Empire France. So in these examples, we see the museum is not being eclipsed or used, but conversed with. You have creation and dialogue with the works. And in this way, the musicians like Rilke are bearing witness to the sometimes transcendent and sometimes troubling communion between viewers and objects of cultural memory. So taking my lead from the robber barons, I want to move us now out of Paris and back to the United States, from the gilded cornices of the Louvre to the corrugated metal expanses of the Udvar-Hazy Annex to the Air and Space Museum outside of Washington, D.C. So, on my most recent pilgrimage there, with my 7-year-old, we found ourselves drawn, along with dozens of other museum visitors that day, to another monument of aeronautic achievement than the space shuttle or the Apollo mission. We moved past the stealth bomber and a Sopwith Camel and the Concorde, and then we came face to face with this shimmering silver plane with massively wide wings and 4 propellers and this glass nose that looks like something out of Star Wars. And the 7-year-old, of course, wants to know, what is that? So you may recognize it. There's the 7-year-old, and there's the name of the plane. It's the Enola Gay. It is a Boeing B-29 Superfortress dating from 1945, and in the words of the museum, quote, the most sophisticated propeller-driven bomber to fly during World War II, and the first bomber to house its crew in pressurized compartments. Much more comfortable for them. It is part of the World War II aviation section. It entered the museum's collection in the mid-1980s. It is, of course, also the aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, leading to the deaths of an estimated tens of thousands of people and the complete destruction of the city. So the aircraft caused this havoc in a rather straightforward way. It came, it saw, it dropped the bomb, but it inadvertently created another round of havoc in the 1980s and the 1990s after it was acquired by the museum and plans were made to put it on display. So after languishing in restoration workshops for some years, the aircraft was due to be part of an exhibition in 1995 that would mark the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Initial plans called for substantial attention to the impact of the bomb on Japan, but no sooner were these plans revealed than opposition was voiced from the American Legion, from members of Congress, and from veterans of the Second World War, including the Enola Gay's captain, who believed that the intended verbiage belittled and even criminalized the contributions of the plane and the much larger community of soldiers, engineers, technicians, political leaders, and everyday Americans involved. So the museum revised its plans, but still the disputes continued between those who viewed the bomb as a lifesaver, ending the war sooner than it or otherwise would have ended, and those who deemed it as an unspeakable atrocity. So after a very public debate, the intended exhibition was scrapped, the museum director resigned, and the restored plane went on permanent display in 2003 as part of the permanent collection with this text, which is relatively, I'll just leave it up there if you want to have a look, but it's pretty neutral. It describes the plane and then mentions that it dropped a bomb, but that's it. There's no judgment. So to me, as a graduate student, when I read about studying museums, museum history, and I read about the Enola Gay controversy, it was an academic case. It was a case study to compare with similar conflicts, something you might cite in a conference paper. But years on, as a parent, I found that answering the questions of a child was much more perplexing and complex. For the kid, the Enola Gay is a shiny, metallic, big, plane, something he'd want the model kit of in the gift shop. For aeronautics engineers, it represents a certain point in the age-old dream of human flight, somewhere on the Hegelian spiral between Leonardo's flying machines and the Enterprise, going boldly where no one has ever gone before. For those who flew in such planes, or whose friends or family may have, it represents a moment of sacrifice and danger, as well as of youth and memory, both personal and collective. For many others, the plane represents an unprecedentedly horrific manner of destruction and the loss of many innocent lives. It is, in fact, all of these things. The question that is raised by the display of such an object is, whose narrative, whose memory? These are the questions that are very much at the heart of the recent controversies that we've seen here in the United States, as well as globally, regarding certain monuments. In addition to the protests of statues of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Sam in North Carolina, what's his name? Sam. And the depiction of Native Americans as sort of a subject race in statues that still exist in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., among others. We've seen sustained reactions in the UK and South Africa against statues of Cecil Rhodes, who's perhaps best known in the United States as founder of the Rhodes Scholarship, but also an imperialist who is held partially responsible for the development of apartheid. Essentially, all these protests oppose the memorialization of figures whose actions are seen as negative. So the thing is that monuments and museum objects do not exist in a vacuum. They are always viewed by particular viewers in a particular setting. There's a robust literature on material culture, sociology of art, even thing theory that explores aura and agency within objects. And yet the messages that they deliver is still nuanced depending on the context in which they are apprehended. The intended use of an airplane is nullified when it's placed in a museum. It no longer transports passengers or drops bombs, but it becomes a piece of aeronautical history. Similarly, the use value of objects of religious devotion is nullified when they are removed from a church and presented as objects of aesthetic or historical interest in a museum, in an art museum. In the recent disputes over monuments, the realm of memory has become a battle site, heated at best, deadly at worst, as the realm is interpreted differently on both sides. But how do we deal with this? Do we need to tear down all the statues? So mindful of the life work of Solzhenitsyn, whose experience in a repressive regime is at the heart of this year's conference, there's a suggestion that might be instructive in a formerly communist site in Budapest. Sorry, here we're back in Hiroshima. This is a picture of Stalin's boots in a place called the Memento Park, where one can encounter what they call the biggest statues of the Cold War. They gather together objects from the communist era of 1945 to 1989. They have allegorical monuments of Hungarian-Soviet friendship, statues or fragments of famous personalities from the labor movement, soldiers of the Red Army, and figures such as Lenin, Marx, and Engels. The park's designer explains that, quote, "This park is about dictatorship, and at the same time, because it can be talked about, this park is about democracy. After all, only democracy can provide an opportunity to think freely about dictatorship, or about democracy, come to that, or about anything." End quote. The concept here is not simply to destroy the memorials of monuments that we'd rather not think about, but to place them in a context in which they can engender discourse. In a functioning democracy, different viewpoints can be and are expressed. So moving towards a conclusion, I'd like to recall the opening scene again of that video. We have the angel in white sneakers and torn jeans and dreadlocks, who's a messenger between the mundane and the beyond. So I would like to propose that, at best, this is what museums and monuments are. They're places of communication between physical, earthly objects and the otherworldly and tangible realm of memory. Time past, present, and future, sites where matter and spirit meet. Now there's another place where this occurs, namely the church. And this is a comparison that has recurred at intervals from the origins of the modern museum during the Enlightenment. I think Liz dates it back a little bit further than that, but that's another discussion too. And the comparison has become very current again, museums, cathedrals, since the late 1990s when we started to see the birth of this kind of large-scale global museum. The Guggenheim in Bilbao opened in 1997, the Louvre in Abu Dhabi that opened last year. And the attendance numbers have shot up while church numbers can continue to kind of go down. So museum and church can both be places of pilgrimage, as we've talked about, and of ritual. Both are places of community. But of course, there's one very obvious aspect of difference, which is God. The museum is more a realm of memory and identity than of divinity. As one curator has succinctly noted, a MoMA curator, the revolutionary minds of the 18th century saw in the idea of the museum a worthy successor to the churches they sought to abolish. And yet, churches and museums, as well as museums and memorials, are places where object-based contemplation is practiced. In both, a ritual is that of looking at things, whether they're statues on plinths or gestures performed at the altar. And when this practice is undertaken with intelligence, respect, and humility, it can bring communion with powers higher than those of discord and strife. On the eve of the American Civil War, in his first inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln voiced his hope, if ultimately a vain one, that the discord then within the nation would be resolved without bloodshed, and that remarkably this would occur through the power of memory. And these are his words. "We are not enemies but friends. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." So how do we keep these mystic chords in tune? How do we keep them from disintegrating into cacophony? I posit that when we hold earnest conversation with the object in a museum or the monument before us, when we learn about its history and where it has been, when we sense the multiple perspectives and contradictions that can coexist in the same object, we open the door for these better angels of our nature, and we begin the process of moving from discord to discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So we have a few minutes for Q&A, and I would just ask, again, questions, not statements or comments, just because we have so little time. So here.
Ask a question.
Excellent.
And this is maybe a sidebar question to Liz about Jay-Z and Beyonce, but my question to you, right, would be, Jennifer, one, I applaud your courage in introducing such cultural heresy in a context such as this, but the question is, what would have been the appropriate way, in your view, for Beyonce and Jay-Z, if they wanted to make an artistic or cultural statement, what would have been the appropriate way, which would have been less
Can you hear me? So, yeah, I hope I didn't come across as that I think it's bad or something like that, because I don't, actually. I started out indifferent, actually, because it's just not the music that I listen to. And so I purely, yeah. No, but I watched it with curiosity, and at first I just, like, I didn't really understand, because it's like not a, it's not a vernacular that I'm really familiar with. But as I watched it over and over again, I was really the view that I was most struck with at the end was these beautiful moments, was these moments of conversation with the works. Now, I guess where I'm more critical of their project here is that I get the sense that they are trying to make a critique, and I feel like their critique is not successful, because rather than flipping the power or inviting everybody into the Louvre, or get like doing something else, they just do the same thing that's always been done. You don't think so? Well, I'd love to hear more. I'd love to hear more. Yeah.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Real brief. In the case of the Carters, the larger project with Carter is that, and it's a simple line. He says, achieving wealth in this society is the best revenge. In a context where there is for his neighborhoods very little justice, appeals to justice will not win in what he perceived to be a market society. And so the subtext for Carter, not defending,
Yeah.
thank you for saying, look, I don't know this world. I really applaud your courage and acknowledging, look, the hip-hop game is not my game. I don't know it. I saw this one video, and I'm taking out that shot. I applaud that. All right. I would say that, and it's because of Robin Barron reference. This is a kid who is a descendant of slaves who was raised in a housing development with nothing. And that's not being politically correct. Those are just the facts. And so for him, the wealth thing is an achievement, having from slavery through the ghetto, achieved something. He's not a criminal.
Right.
And so that is the point that he's making. It's a tough read of a society where the discourse for fairness and justice doesn't really play out if you're living in the Bronx. So I think that's, and we can have an offline conversation, because one of my arguments with, the cultural elite is that I had this conversation with Liz last time we were here about engaging the challenge of hip-hop. People are criticizing a thing they haven't studied, which, if it was reversed, and I criticize high culture and didn't study it, I'd be just an ignorant black guy. So what I'm suggesting is simply that there should be a serious consideration of a culture that controls global youth. It's not even black anymore. It's global youth culture. And how do we, the Christians in the church, ignore that? It's sort of like an Alamo thing. Well, we circle the wagons as the unwashed masses and try to infect us with this corrosive culture, which is not a sophisticated way of going at it.
Right. Yeah, I guess just the last thing, we can take the conversation offline. It's just that, the work of an artist like Lorna Simpson, right? Or Theaster Gates. I mean, these are really visually and historic pieces of research into the exclusions and the injustices that we're talking about. And running through the Louvre for a few minutes in designer suits is like, I guess it seems a little superficial, finally, at the end of the day.
You've got Beyonce's thing that
So-
she did on formation.
I'm just going to interrupt.
Yeah,
I'm
okay,
sorry.
we'll talk about it later.
This is
We'll talk-
fascinating.
thank you.
I'd love to
Thank
be.
you.
I'd
No,
love to be
thank you
part
for
of the
your
offline
comments.
conversation too.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just want to continue
Yeah,
with the
I'm
questions.
Anna Marie Landis from the University of St. Thomas. And I was wondering, a question between both of your topics is American government spaces. I just don't see the type of art. I mean, it is America, so it's not going to be Italian art. But how do we bring that lush, rich American heritage in kind of a pluralistic society where we don't have these shared symbols that Italian culture had back in the day?
Well, I would say that I'm not entirely sure that we don't have the same symbols. I mean, the exact same things that Cicero, Sallust, Latini, and then later on Ambrogio managed to design. These are the same, we can all identify that these are the same virtues or vices that make or break a good collective effort in government. The question is, and this speaks more to our present poverty in creating images, and I move to the video, leave the video hanging in the air. We have present poverty in creating very meaningful and uplifting images. What we really need are for artists to be able to come up with a way with creating not necessarily the frescoes of the Lorenzetti frescoes would be very inappropriate in a Congress building, but ideas that are built on representing, first and foremost, I think the privilege that is government. I think one of the things that really makes that painting special is because that painting recognizes first and foremost the concept of these virtues of government as jewels, that you are looking at a crown and that you're looking at something that is truly precious and wonderful because it is a privilege. And even starting from there, I am sure we have plenty of contemporary artists in one medium or another who could come up with ideas to build on that.
Great, this will be our last question.
My name is Alex Erickson, also from University of St. Thomas. And kind of a question for both of you, coming at it from the perspective of the church, how Professor Donnelly mentioned that attendance numbers are plummeting, as I'm sure we all know. What would be the role of art in kind of helping to shift this kind of declining attendance, shift this kind of cultural indifference to the church? What role would art play, whether it's vocal art or art as we commonly think of it? What role would that have in kind of reversing that trend?
My standpoint on this is that the responsibility is with the viewer more than it is with the artist. And that just as it's important for us to educate ourselves intellectually through words, it's important to educate ourselves in reading images. And more than ever today, with the amount of images that we're able to see through the internet and media. And so I think that, first of all, there's no practical way to kind of, make artists bring a certain message. But second of all, even if there were, it's we as the perceivers who need to be able to read even through the most, violent. And I mean, last year, actually the last 2 years, I keep putting up the picture of Piss Christ, which is the crucifix in urine, and it's like I can't get away from it. I always sit in this room and mention it. And the artist of that was actually a fervent Catholic. It's really unusual, but we need to be able to look at something that is offensive. We need to be able to look at Robert E. Lee. We need to look at Jay-Z and read things. I mean, we should be.
I do fundamentally agree with you on the question of education on the viewer. It does fall in the responsibility of Catholics to re-own your tradition of art, but also to be willing to go out and to commission and to support artists. If we have churches without chapels, if we refuse to put art in our own house, if we don't want religious art in our house because we'd rather a picture of flowers, we want a picture of Beyonce, or we want a picture of something, we're already impoverishing art because we don't make it part of our own. And no wonder we can't speak the language. And from there, once we begin to understand what we expect and commissioning art and creating circumstances where artists want to create images that resonate with us, that helps to stimulate a return to art. We have to put artists, Ambrogio Lorenzetti had a really great gig there that he knew he would be famous for the rest of his life, but we can't offer that to artists. So how can we expect people to put 20 years of training to produce a masterpiece that nobody would ever recognize as a masterpiece? I think it's a very, very important part, the viewer learning to take responsibility for his own aesthetic world.
I want to thank you both for your contributions. As always, you reaffirm my belief that art experts need to be fully and gainfully and well employed, well paid. I think we would all benefit, especially in the churches, but that's a separate conversation. If we could just offer one more hand of applause.